In October 2021, in McCulloch County, Texas, 23-year-old Emma Carter stood beside a rusted livestock trailer and watched 12 enormous white bulls step into her failing pasture. They were not ordinary cattle. Each one stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder. Their hides were almost completely white, their eyes pale pink, and their horns curved outward like polished ivory. They were giant albino bulls, bred for size but rejected because nobody knew what to do with them. The auction yard had called them worthless. The bank had called them a liability. 3 neighboring ranchers had laughed when Emma said she would take all 12. And now they were standing on her 48 acres. Emma had $3,814 in her checking account, a $41,000 equipment loan, a broken irrigation pump, and a foreclosure notice taped inside her kitchen cabinet because she couldn't stand looking at it. The bulls were supposed to be the last stupid thing she ever did. At least, that was what everyone thought. The old woman standing beside the trailer didn't laugh. Evelyn Carter, Emma's 71-year-old grandmother, pulled her faded denim jacket tighter against the October wind and watched the animals carefully. "Don't count them," she said. Emma looked at her. "Why?" Evelyn pointed toward the pasture. "Count their shadows." Emma frowned. The sun was low behind them. 12 massive shadows stretched across the dry grass. But one shadow was longer than the others. Emma noticed it immediately. She looked back at the bulls. Nothing seemed different. Then one of the animals turned its head toward the northern fence. The other 11 followed. All 12 stared in exactly the same direction. Emma felt something tighten in her chest. "What are they looking at?" Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the pasture gate. That was when a pickup stopped on the county road. Walter Briggs climbed out. At 58, Walter owned the largest cattle operation within 20 miles. He had 600 head of Angus cattle, 2 John Deere tractors, a new hay baler, and a habit of smiling whenever somebody else made a mistake. He looked at the bulls. Then he looked at Emma. Then he laughed. Not quietly. Not politely. Loud enough for the 2 ranch hands in his truck to hear. "Emma," he called, "you finally found a way to lose money faster than your father did." Emma said nothing. Walter walked closer. "You know why those animals were rejected?" "Yes. They burn feed." "I know. They're hard on fences." "I know. They don't fit any commercial program around here." "I know." Walter shook his head. "Then what exactly did you buy?" Emma rested both hands on the wooden gate. "I didn't buy them." That stopped him. "The auction gave them to me." Walter stared. "For free." Emma nodded. He laughed again. "That's worse." Evelyn looked at him. "You might want to wait before laughing." Walter's smile faded slightly. "Why?" The old woman pointed toward the northern pasture. "Because those bulls aren't watching the road." Walter turned. The animals were still facing north. The pasture beyond the fence looked empty. Dry mesquite. Dead weeds. A shallow depression in the ground. Nothing else. Walter shrugged. "Cattle stare at things." "Not 12 at once," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment, then climbed back into his truck. "Good luck." The truck disappeared down the road. Emma waited until the sound of the engine faded. Then she looked at her grandmother. "You know something." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "I know your grandfather used to keep white cattle." Emma blinked. "Granddad never told me that." "He didn't tell many people." "Why?" Evelyn looked toward the northern fence. "Because he stopped talking about them after 1987. That was the first time Emma became afraid of the bulls. Not because they were enormous. Not because they were albino. Because her grandfather had apparently known something about them. And whatever it was, Evelyn didn't seem ready to explain. That night, Emma barely slept. The wind pushed dust against the farmhouse windows. Somewhere outside, one of the bulls made a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to travel through the walls. At 2:17 in the morning, Emma heard the cattle gate slam. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the pasture. The 12 bulls were no longer scattered across the field. They were standing shoulder to shoulder beside the northern fence. Emma walked closer. Every animal was facing the same patch of ground. She raised her flashlight. There was nothing there. Then she noticed the grass. It was greener. Not much. Just a narrow strip running along the inside of the fence. Emma crouched. She touched it. The soil beneath the grass was damp. She dug her fingers into it. An inch down, the ground was cool and dark. She stared at her hand. The rest of the pasture had been powder dry for months. There had been no rain in 8 days. Emma slowly stood. One of the bulls stepped toward her. Its huge head lowered. For a second, Emma thought it might charge. Instead, the animal nudged the ground with its nose. Once. Twice. Then it pawed the dirt. A small piece of rusted metal appeared. Emma knelt and pulled it free. It was an old brass valve handle. She recognized it immediately. Her grandfather had used the same kind of handle on the farm's abandoned irrigation system. Emma looked toward the farmhouse. Then toward the 12 bulls. The animals had stopped moving. They were watching her. And suddenly, Emma understood why Evelyn had told her not to count the bulls. The question wasn't why 12 unwanted animals had ended up on her farm. The question was why they had been brought there at all. At sunrise, Emma drove her grandfather's old Ford 8N toward the northern field. The tractor had been built in the late 1940s, long before Emma was born. Its faded blue paint was almost gone, but Evelyn insisted it had never failed her husband when the land needed work. Emma had repaired the fuel line herself that summer. The tractor coughed twice. Then started. She smiled despite herself. For the first time in weeks, something on the farm sounded alive. She drove toward the fence. The bulls moved aside. But instead of spreading across the pasture, they followed the tractor. All 12. Emma stopped. They stopped. She moved again. They followed. That was when she noticed something even stranger. Their hooves weren't crushing the green strip. They were walking along both sides of it, as if they knew exactly where the hidden water line was. Emma shut off the tractor. The silence returned. She climbed down. At her feet, beneath the dry Texas grass, ran a narrow line of green vegetation. And beneath that vegetation was something nobody in the county had seen in decades. Emma took a shovel from the tractor. She pushed it into the ground. The blade struck metal. Once. Hard. Emma froze. Then she looked at the bulls. The largest one lowered its head toward the earth. And Emma heard water moving underneath the ground. Not much. Just a faint rushing sound. But it was there. And somewhere beneath her dying pasture, something was still flowing. Emma kept the shovel in the ground. For several seconds, she didn't move. The faint sound beneath her boots was impossible to ignore. Water. Not imagined water. Not condensation. Not an old pipe rattling in the wind. Actual water was moving beneath a pasture that had been dry enough to crack open like pottery. She looked at the 12 bulls. They stood silently around her. The largest bull lowered its head again. Emma pulled the shovel free. "Okay," she whispered. "Show me." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because the animals had already shown her more than anyone else had. She drove the shovel down again. The blade struck metal. Emma dug around it carefully. At about 8 inches deep, she uncovered a narrow galvanized pipe. It disappeared beneath the fence and continued toward the northern edge of the property. Emma followed it. The pipe was old. Very old. Its surface was covered with rust, but the joints were unusually intact. She climbed onto the Ford 8N and drove along the line. The bulls followed. That became the first thing that frightened her. The second came 20 minutes later. The pipe didn't lead toward the farmhouse. It didn't lead toward the well. It led away from both. It disappeared beneath a section of land Emma had always considered useless. A low, rocky patch where nothing grew. Her grandfather had called it the dead corner. Emma had never understood why. She parked the tractor and walked closer. A piece of white limestone sat half-buried in the dirt. She kicked it aside. Beneath it was another valve. This one was larger. She brushed dirt away. A date had been stamped into the metal. 1986. Emma's stomach tightened. That was the year before her grandfather stopped raising cattle. She stood there for a long time. Then she heard an engine. Walter Briggs was coming down the road. He stopped beside the fence and climbed out. "What are you doing?" "Fixing irrigation." Walter looked at the dead corner. "There's no irrigation there." Emma pointed to the pipe. "There is." Walter walked over. He crouched. For once, he didn't laugh. He scraped dirt from the metal with his thumb. His expression changed. "Where did you find this?" "Under the pasture." Walter looked at the date. Then at Emma. "Your grandfather built this?" "I don't know." Walter stood. "Emma, that system was abandoned before you were born." "Why?" He didn't answer. That silence told her more than his words would have. "You know." Walter looked toward the bulls. "I know your grandfather was experimenting with something." "What?" "White cattle." Emma felt the same cold sensation she had felt the night before. "Why?" Walter sighed. "Because he believed they could survive conditions other cattle couldn't." Emma almost laughed. "But everyone says these bulls are useless." "Everyone says a lot of things." Walter walked back toward his truck. Emma followed. "What happened in 1987? He stopped. "Your grandfather's cattle died." "All of them?" "Not exactly." Walter looked at her. "That's the part nobody talks about." Before Emma could ask another question, Walter drove away. That evening, Emma found Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table with an old metal toolbox open in front of her. Inside was a stack of notebooks. Emma recognized the handwriting. Her grandfather's. "You knew," Emma said. Evelyn didn't look up. "I suspected." "You knew about the pipe." "I knew about the system." Emma sat down. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn closed the toolbox. "Because your grandfather spent 34 years trying to make people understand something they weren't ready to understand." "What?" Evelyn looked toward the window. "That cattle don't always fail because they're weak." She paused. "Sometimes the land fails them." Emma stared at the notebooks. "What happened to his cattle?" "Heat. Drought." "Heat, drought, poor forage." "Then why the white bulls?" "Because he was looking for cattle that reflected more sunlight." Emma looked confused. Evelyn continued. "Dark cattle absorb more solar radiation. White coats reflect more. It doesn't make an animal immune to heat, but under brutal summer conditions, coat color can affect heat load." Emma thought of the 12 bulls. Their pale hides. Their huge bodies. Their strange behavior. Then why were they rejected? Evelyn smiled sadly. Because nobody wanted to wait long enough to find out what they could do. That night Emma read the notebooks. Most were ordinary ranch records. Feed amounts. Breeding dates. Rainfall totals. Calf weights. But several pages had been underlined. One sentence appeared again and again. "Water changes everything." Another page contained a hand-drawn map of the farm. Emma placed it beside the modern property map. The northern pipe was marked in blue. But the old map showed something else. A reservoir. Underground. Emma stared at it. The reservoir was beneath the dead corner. The place everyone had considered useless. She grabbed her boots. Evelyn stood behind her. "Where are you going?" "To see if your husband was right." "You won't find it tonight." Emma stopped. "Why?" "Because you're looking at the wrong thing." Evelyn pointed toward the bulls. "Watch them." Emma walked outside. The moon had risen. The 12 bulls were no longer at the northern fence. They were standing in a circle around a shallow depression in the ground. Emma approached. One bull stepped backward. Another lowered its head. The earth beneath them was dark. Emma touched it. Wet. She grabbed the flashlight. There was a faint smell of minerals. She dug. At 6 inches, her shovel struck something hollow. She cleared more soil. A concrete cover appeared. Emma's heart began beating faster. She called Evelyn. The old woman came slowly across the yard. When she saw the concrete, she stopped. "You found it." Emma stared at her. "You knew it was here." "I knew where your grandfather said it was." "What is it?" Evelyn didn't answer. Emma pulled away another layer of dirt. A faded stencil appeared. Carter Range Water Recovery, 1986. Below it was another line. "Do not open until the land is ready." Emma looked at Evelyn. "What does that mean?" Evelyn's eyes remained fixed on the words. "I never knew." Emma reached for the metal cover. Then she heard a truck. This time, it wasn't Walter. 3 trucks came through the gate. A man in a white county shirt stepped out. Malcolm Reeves, the county livestock inspector. Behind him stood 2 ranchers Emma recognized from the auction. They weren't smiling. Malcolm held a clipboard. "We've received a complaint." Emma frowned. "About what?" "The bulls. They haven't done anything. They're classified as high-risk livestock." "Because they're big?" "Because nobody has verified their breeding history." Emma felt anger rising. Nobody cared about their breeding history when the auction was going to send them to slaughter. Malcolm looked uncomfortable. "That may be true." One of the ranchers spoke. "There's something strange about them." Emma glanced at the bulls. "What?" "They don't drink from the trough." She looked toward the pasture. He was right. The trough was full. The bulls had ignored it. Instead, they had been drinking from tiny damp patches near the northern fence. Malcolm stepped closer. "Where is that water coming from?" Emma said nothing. He followed her eyes toward the concrete cover. His expression changed. "What is that?" Before Emma could answer, the largest bull suddenly walked forward. It stopped beside the concrete. Then it struck the cover with one hoof. The metal rang through the pasture. Everyone went silent. The bull struck it again. This time, the cover shifted. A thin stream of water escaped from beneath it. The ranchers stepped backward. Emma crouched. Clear water ran over the concrete. Not muddy. Not stagnant. Cold. She put her hand into it. Her fingers trembled. Malcolm stared at the stream. "That shouldn't be possible." Evelyn whispered from behind them. "Your grandfather said the same thing." The next morning, the county arrived with equipment. Emma expected them to shut the system down. Instead, Malcolm brought a soil scientist. Dr. Laura Bennett spent 2 hours examining the ground. She took soil samples from 3 different locations. Then she examined the green strip where the bulls had been standing. "There's moisture movement beneath this entire section," she said. Emma asked, "From where?" Laura looked at the old map. "I don't know yet." She dug deeper. At nearly 3 feet, the soil changed. It became dark and dense. Laura rubbed it between her fingers. "This is not ordinary dryland soil." Emma waited. "What is it?" Laura looked toward the dead corner. "It's an old floodplain deposit." Emma frowned. "This land has never flooded." Laura shook her head. "Not recently." She stood and looked across the pasture. "Your grandfather may have built this system on top of an ancient underground drainage channel." Emma felt the pieces moving together. The buried pipe. The reservoir. The bulls. The green grass. But one question remained. Why had the bulls known where to stand? Laura answered before Emma asked. "Cattle can detect subtle differences in temperature, moisture, vegetation, and sometimes mineral concentration." She pointed toward the bulls. "They're not finding magic. They're finding water." Emma looked at the 12 animals. For months, everyone had seen 12 useless bulls. Emma was beginning to see 12 living instruments. But the biggest discovery came 3 days later. Emma opened the old reservoir. Inside, beneath decades of sediment, she found a second pipe. It wasn't connected to the irrigation system. It ran toward the county road. And according to her grandfather's map, it connected to a buried spring that crossed 3 neighboring ranches. That meant the water wasn't only hers. It was moving underneath the entire valley. And someone had been trying to keep it hidden. That evening, Walter Briggs returned. He parked beside the farmhouse. He didn't laugh this time. He carried an old photograph. He placed it on Emma's kitchen table. The photograph showed her grandfather standing beside 12 white cattle. Emma stared at the animals. They were younger, smaller, but unmistakable. 12. Exactly 12. On the back of the photograph, her grandfather had written 4 words. Keep them until 2021. Emma looked up. Why 2021? Walter's face had gone pale. Because that's when he believed the valley would need them. Outside, one of the giant bulls bellowed. Then 11 others answered. And somewhere beneath the pasture, the old water system began to move again. The sound beneath the pasture lasted 11 seconds. Emma stood completely still. The old pipes groaned under the earth, followed by a deep rushing noise that seemed to travel beneath the farmhouse. Then it stopped. Outside, all 12 bulls raised their heads. Walter Briggs looked at Emma. Your grandfather knew. Emma stared at the photograph on the kitchen table. 12 white cattle. 12 years earlier. No. The photograph had been taken decades ago. The animals in it were the same bloodline as the bulls outside. Emma turned the photograph over again. Keep them until 2021. Her grandfather had died in 2004. He had written the message long before anyone knew what 2021 would bring. Drought, Emma whispered. Walter nodded. Probably. Probably. Your grandfather wasn't predicting the weather. Walter pointed toward the map. He was predicting what would happen to the water. That changed everything. For 3 days, Emma stopped thinking about saving the farm. She started thinking about the valley. The 12 bulls remained near the northern pasture. Every morning, they walked the same route. They grazed along the green strip. Then they moved toward the dead corner. Then they stopped beside the concrete reservoir. Emma began recording everything. Temperature, wind, soil moisture, bull movement, water levels, feed consumption. She wrote it all in her grandfather's old notebook. At first, the ranchers thought she was wasting time. Then something strange happened. The grass around the bulls became greener. Not everywhere, only where they walked. Emma noticed that they weren't simply eating the grass. They were pushing through the dry surface and exposing damp soil beneath it. Their hooves broke the hard crust. Their manure returned nutrients. Their bodies shaded small areas of ground during the hottest part of the afternoon. It wasn't magic. It was pressure. Nature responding to animals in a specific place. Emma began rotating them carefully. The pasture changed. Within 2 weeks, tiny shoots appeared. By the 3rd week, native grasses were returning. Then the weather turned. A cold front came through from the north. Rain was forecast. Only half an inch. Emma didn't think much of it. Walter did. He called that afternoon. Move the bulls. Why? Flash flooding. Emma looked toward the clear sky. There's barely any rain coming. Walter's voice became serious. It's not about here. What do you mean? Upstream. That night, the rain arrived. Not on Emma's farm. 40 miles north. Water moved through dry channels and low ravines, filling the buried drainage system beneath the valley. At 3:40 in the morning, Emma woke to a sound she had never heard on the property. Water. She ran outside. The northern pasture was glowing beneath the moon. A narrow ribbon of water was moving through the grass. The 12 bulls stood on either side of it. They weren't panicking. They were watching it. Emma grabbed her flashlight. The water continued moving south, toward the dead corner. Then the reservoir filled. The concrete cover began to tremble. Emma stepped backward. The ground vibrated. A section of old pipe burst through the soil. Water shot upward. The 12 bulls scattered. For 30 seconds, the dead corner became a fountain. Then the pressure dropped. Silence returned. Emma stared at the water. She had never seen her farm this alive. The next morning, Walter arrived with 2 ranchers. They didn't come to laugh. They came carrying offers. The first was $40,000 for 4 bulls. Emma refused. The second offered $65,000 for 6. She refused again. Walter looked at her. You're turning down money you desperately need. I know. Why? Emma looked at the pasture. Because I don't think the bulls are the valuable part. Walter frowned. Then what is? Emma pointed toward the water. Whatever they're finding. That answer changed Walter's expression. He had spent 30 years raising cattle. He knew the difference between an animal being valuable and an animal revealing something valuable. But he didn't know what Emma had found yet. The county did. Malcolm Reeves returned with Dr. Laura Bennett. This time, Laura brought ground-penetrating radar equipment. They scanned the northern field. The machine produced a strange pattern. Laura stared at the screen. What? Emma asked. Laura zoomed in. There are channels underneath this property. How many? At least 4. Emma's heart sank. Water. Probably. Laura shook her head. We need to dig. They chose a location 20 yards from the reservoir. Emma brought out the Ford 8N to mark the site, but Laura stopped her. Not with that. Emma smiled faintly. It's stronger than it looks. I know. Laura pointed toward the ground. But if there is a void beneath us, we don't want a tractor falling into it. Emma shut off the engine. For the first time, the old Ford seemed small. The county brought a compact excavator. The first foot revealed gravel. The second exposed clay. At 3 feet, the soil became black. At 4 feet, water appeared. Laura stepped into the trench. She picked up a handful of soil. This is old. How old? Decades. She looked toward the hills. This valley once held much more surface water than it does today. Emma thought of her grandfather. His maps. His cattle. His warning. Then Laura found something. A plastic irrigation tag. She cleaned it. A number was printed on the side. C12. Emma froze. 12. Laura looked confused. What? Emma pointed toward the pasture. The bulls. Laura looked at the animals. Emma walked to the barn. She returned carrying another piece of paper. Her grandfather's breeding records. 12 bull numbers. C1 through C12. They weren't random cattle. They were part of a long-term experiment. Her grandfather had selected animals with pale coats, large frames, calm temperaments, and strong grazing behavior. He had bred them to work in extreme heat. But the experiment had failed commercially. Or so everyone believed. Emma turned the final page. There was a handwritten note. Do not sell them separately. Below it. They work as a herd. Emma stared at the words. The 12 bulls had been selected not simply for genetics. They had been selected for behavior. Together, they moved toward moisture. Together, they opened compacted soil. Together, they grazed strategically. And together, they were revealing the buried water network. That afternoon, a television crew arrived. Someone had posted a video of the bulls online. The clip showed all 12 white animals standing around the reservoir. It spread across Texas ranching groups. By sunset, reporters were calling Emma's farmhouse. She refused interviews. She didn't want attention. But attention had already arrived. The following morning, 47 vehicles lined the county road. Ranchers came from 3 counties. Some wanted to see the bulls. Others wanted to buy them. A cattle buyer from Amarillo offered $100,000 for the herd. Emma refused. Then another buyer offered $150,000. She refused again. The crowd began whispering. Walter stood beside her. You understand what you're doing? Yes. No, I don't think you do. He looked at the bulls. They're becoming famous. Emma shook her head. They're becoming useful. Walter smiled. That's exactly what your grandfather used to say. Then a man stepped out of a black SUV. He wore a dark jacket despite the heat. His name was Charles Harlan. He represented a consortium of large ranches across West Texas. He walked slowly toward Emma. I'll give you $500,000. The crowd went silent. Emma didn't answer. Charles continued. $500,000. Cash purchase. All 12. Emma looked at the bulls. The largest one was grazing. Its head moved slowly across the grass. It seemed completely uninterested in the money being discussed around it. Emma shook her head. No. Charles smiled. You're 23. I know. You have a farm about to be foreclosed. I know. You're turning down $500,000. I know. Why? Emma looked at the old photograph. Because you don't want the bulls. Charles frowned. What do you mean? You want what they found. The smile disappeared from his face. Nobody spoke. Then Charles turned toward the reservoir. How much water is under your land? Emma said nothing. He stepped closer. How much? I don't know. Charles looked at Walter. Walter looked away. That was when Emma understood something. Charles already knew. He knew about the underground water. And he wasn't the first person who had known. That evening, Emma found an envelope tucked inside her grandfather's toolbox. It contained a letter dated 1991. She read it twice. Her grandfather had written about a meeting with 3 neighboring ranchers. They had discovered the underground channels. They had also discovered that the water continued beneath several properties. But the county had refused to recognize the system because no one wanted to fund the restoration. So the ranchers abandoned it. Except her grandfather. He kept studying it. And near the bottom of the letter, he had written something that made Emma's hands shake. One day, the cattle will show them. Emma lowered the letter. Outside, the bulls were moving again. All 12. Slowly. Toward the western fence. Emma grabbed her flashlight and followed. They stopped at an old mesquite tree. The largest bull pawed the ground. Emma dug. 5 inches. 10. 15. The shovel hit wood. She cleared the dirt. A wooden box appeared. Inside was a metal cylinder. Emma opened it. There was one final map. This one was different. It showed the entire valley. Every ranch. Every underground channel. Every natural spring. And across the bottom, her grandfather had written, "If the drought comes, don't sell the cattle. Open the valley." Emma stared at the words. Then she looked toward the distant ranches. The drought had already come. And the 12 bulls weren't just saving her farm. They were pointing toward something that could change the entire valley. But before Emma could move, she heard a truck stop behind her. Walter stepped out. His face was pale. Emma. She turned. What? He held up his phone. Charles Harlan just bought the ranch south of yours. Emma's stomach dropped. Why? Walter looked toward the map. Because he knows exactly where the underground water runs. A second truck stopped. Then another. And in the darkness beyond the fence, headlights began appearing one after another. The ranchers weren't coming to buy cattle anymore. They were coming for the water. Emma stood beneath the mesquite tree with the old map trembling in her hands. Beyond the fence, headlights continued appearing. One truck. Then another. Then 6 more. The ranchers had come because they believed the 12 bulls had discovered something worth millions. They were right. But they were wrong about what it was. Walter stepped beside Emma. Don't show them the map. I'm not. What are you going to do? Emma looked toward the bulls. Follow them. At sunrise, she did. The 12 bulls moved west. They crossed the pasture slowly, stopping every few hundred yards. Emma marked each location. Where they stopped, the ground was cooler. Where they pawed, moisture appeared. Where they grazed, grass returned. By noon, Emma had discovered a pattern. The bulls weren't randomly searching. They were following the buried water channel her grandfather had mapped decades earlier. But the channel didn't end at Emma's farm. It crossed the properties of 7 neighboring ranches. And every ranch was struggling. Cattle were being sold. Fields were drying. Wells were dropping. The land was failing one ranch at a time. Emma finally understood her grandfather's last sentence. Open the valley. The water had never belonged to one farm. The ranchers had simply forgotten where it was. That afternoon, Emma called a meeting at the old livestock barn. Walter came. Malcolm came. Laura came. Even Charles Harlan came. Emma placed the map on the table. "This is not my water," she said. Nobody spoke. "The underground system crosses all 7 ranches." Charles folded his arms. "And what exactly are you proposing?" "Restore it." Charles laughed quietly. "With what money?" Emma looked at him. "The same money everyone keeps offering me for the bulls." He smiled. "You still won't sell?" "No." Then Emma did something nobody expected. She opened the barn doors. The 12 bulls walked inside. Every rancher stared. They were enormous. White hides glowing in the afternoon sun. Dust floating around their hooves. For months, people had called them defective. Worthless. A mistake. Now every eye in the barn was on them. Emma pointed toward the animals. "My grandfather bred these bulls to survive heat, use forage efficiently, and respond to water movement." Laura added quietly, "And their grazing has helped expose the buried system." Emma nodded. "The bulls aren't the treasure." She looked at the ranchers. "They're the proof." The first rancher stepped forward. "How much will it cost?" Laura answered. "Less than losing another decade of groundwater." The meeting lasted 4 hours. By sunset, something extraordinary had happened. The ranchers stopped arguing about buying the bulls. They started arguing about how to restore the valley. A cooperative was formed. 7 ranches. 1 water system. 1 herd. 12 bulls. But Emma still had one problem. Her foreclosure deadline was 9 days away. The bank wasn't interested in maps. It wasn't interested in old cattle experiments. It wanted money. On the 8th day, Emma drove the Ford 8N to the bank. She arrived wearing the same faded work jacket she had worn when she accepted the bulls. The bank manager sat across from her. "We can't postpone the foreclosure." Emma placed a folder on his desk. "What if I don't ask you to?" He opened it. Inside were contracts from 7 ranches. Water restoration agreements. Cattle breeding agreements. Grazing leases. And one final document. A purchase offer for the 12 bulls. The number at the bottom made him stop. $2,400,000. He looked up. Who offered this? 23 ranchers. All for the bulls. Emma shook her head. "They're buying the breeding program." The bulls would remain on Emma's farm. Their genetics would be licensed. Their offspring would be sold. The original 12 animals would become the foundation of a new heat-adapted cattle program. The bank manager stared at the contract. Then he looked at Emma. "You turned down $500,000. "Yes." "And now you're getting $2.4 million. Emma shook her head. "Not exactly." She looked through the window. The Ford 8N was parked outside. The bulls stood beyond it. "The money is for what my grandfather spent 34 years building." The manager signed the agreement. The foreclosure was canceled. But the most important moment happened 3 weeks later. The restored water channel was opened. Workers removed an old blockage near the western ranch. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the ground began to tremble. A thin stream appeared. It became a flow. The flow became a rushing channel. Water moved through the old underground system exactly as Emma's grandfather had predicted. The ranchers stood silently. Then Walter removed his hat. "I laughed at you," he said. Emma looked at him. "I know. I was wrong." Emma smiled slightly. "You were." Walter laughed. Then he extended his hand. Emma shook it. Across the pasture, the 12 bulls began moving toward the water. They walked together. Slowly, calmly. The sight became the photograph newspapers would publish across the state. 12 giant albino bulls standing beside a newly restored Texas water channel, their white hides bright against green grass that hadn't existed months earlier. People saw the photograph and called it a miracle. Emma never did. She knew better. The bulls had simply been listening to the land. 5 years later, the valley looked different. The restored water system supported 7 ranches. Native grasses had returned. The cattle herds had grown. Emma's farm had become a training operation for heat-adapted cattle. The original 12 bulls were older now. Some moved slowly. One had died naturally. The remaining 11 still followed the same routes. Walter became chairman of the Valley Cooperative. He kept a framed photograph in his office. It showed Emma beside the bulls on the day he had laughed at her. Underneath, he had written, "I should have listened sooner." The old Ford 8N remained in Emma's equipment shed. Its paint was still faded. Its seat was still cracked. But every spring, Emma started it. Usually on the first crank. The grandchildren of the original 12 bulls now grazed across hundreds of acres. Some were white. Some were cream. Some carried Docker markings. But all inherited the traits Emma's grandfather had spent decades protecting. The program eventually became worth far more than the original $2.4 million. Emma never became interested in becoming rich. She still wore the same work boots. Still repaired fences herself. Still checked the soil before trusting the weather report. And every October, she walked to the northern pasture. She would stand beneath the old mesquite tree where the final map had been buried. The land was green now. The underground channel flowed quietly below her feet. One morning, Emma heard the familiar sound of hooves. She turned. The new herd was coming toward her. At the front walked the largest white bull. Its head was lowered. Its nose touched the grass. Then it looked up at Emma. Behind it came the others. Not 12 anymore. Dozens. Emma smiled. She remembered the auction yard. The laughter. The foreclosure notice. The old trailer. 12 animals nobody wanted. People had seen 12 useless bulls. She had seen 12 clues. And the land had been waiting for somebody to listen. Years later, ranchers would still tell the story. They would remember the $2.4 million. They would remember the drought. They would remember the strange white cattle. But Emma remembered something smaller. One October morning. A quiet pasture. Green grass growing where nobody expected it. And the sound of water moving underneath the earth. Before anyone else believed it was there. Sometimes a farm isn't saved by what you bring to the land. Sometimes it's saved by what the land has been trying to show you.